Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, organizers, for putting together this fascinating summit. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak to you for a few minutes. And it's always, I have to point out, a mixed blessing to speak after Eddie. On the one hand, you get to listen to a fantastic presentation. On the other hand, afterwards, you have to try to somehow fit in his huge footsteps. So I'll do my best and would love to use my time to talk a little bit about the research that we do at the Immigration Policy Lab, but then very quickly focus on one particular project, namely a data-driven approach to improve refugee allocation and subsequent integration, and talk a little more about how we are testing this approach jointly with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration. And that's why I'm also particularly keen to listen to the keynote presentations by Cornelia Lüthi and later to Mario Gattiker. And maybe at the end, we have some time to discuss some of the first learnings that we have from this project about how to set up collaborations between researchers and policymakers in order to both design, but also test and implement innovative policies. So that's the brief agenda. I'll do a very quick introduction, then I'll focus on this particular approach to improve refugee outcomes. I will talk about the implementation case study and then focus on some first learnings. Just very briefly, what's the Immigration Policy Lab? As mentioned before, we have two branches. It's an interdisciplinary team of researchers, political scientists, economists, sociologists, health scholars, but also data scientists, statisticians, and program managers. On the one hand here at ETH Zurich, but also at Stanford University. And what we do is that we evaluate and design policies surrounding the integration of immigrants, also refugees, asylum seekers, and what we call new citizens, that is, migrants who undergo the naturalization process in their new home country. I hope we can claim that we specialize in partnerships. We don't work in the ivory tower, but with governments and immigrant service providers, also international organizations such as IOM and UNHCR, to, on the one hand, provide rigorous evaluations to figure out which immigration and which integration policies work, but also to work with these organizations to design and innovate new policies. And one particular example is the GeoMatch algorithm that I will talk about in a second. We developed this algorithm in a context which is, in a way, the model of today's summit, namely the question, what kind of policies are, on the one hand, the most effective, on the other hand, also the most cost efficient in facilitating successful integration into host countries and economies of refugees and other type of migrants. And that's not only good for refugees and migrants, but also strengthens social cohesion and thereby benefits host communities as well. And what we focus on today is some of our data-driven tools that on the one hand have the potential to deepen our understanding of what are the drivers of successful migrant integration outcomes, but also, as we'll see, can serve as inputs for personalized policy recommendations. So how does that work in practice? Here's one example, our GeoMatch algorithm. The starting point of this development was a lot of conversations that we had at both branches of IPL with our various stakeholders, including with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration. And I'm not simplifying too much when I say that the factors, as probably all the people in the audience know, that shape economic self-sufficiency and that are usually the focus is, on the one hand, personal characteristics, the education, the skill level, the work experience that refugees bring with them, but also that geographic location matters. There's a lot of academic research, policy reports that show where you're placed, in which municipality, in which type of economy, in which type of neighborhood, really shapes integration outcomes in both the short, but also medium and long term. And what we focus on today is the synergies between the geographic location and the characteristics of the places that people are assigned to, and the personal characteristics of refugees. And as we'll see, not only are we able to identify these synergies, but we are able to leverage them to optimize placement of future refugees. So let me talk about those factors briefly. I'll do that in the context of Switzerland and using Swiss data, but from work with other government organizations in other countries, such as the Canadian and the Swedish and the Dutch country, we know that the pattern that we identify here also apply to many other contexts. So what we see here is for refugees, that is asylum seekers who got protection status and are allowed to stay in Switzerland 3 years after arrival, we see the share of those refugees across the 26 Swiss cantons that do have gainful employment, that do have a job. And what we see, I think, is two striking features here. On the one hand, we see that for a lot of refugees, that transition into the labor market was successful. We see that on average, about a third of refugees after 3 years have a job. There is also obviously room for improvement here because 2/3 of the people do not have a job. But the second striking feature is that we see quite a bit of heterogeneity, quite a bit of variance across the different Swiss cantons, where the average employment after 3 years ranges between 15 and almost 50%. And so what that means is that in some cantons, this transition into employment works better than in other cantons. And that has a lot of reasons, a lot of factors that are contributing to that, including the general state of the economy, but also obviously cantonal specific integration policy. What is not a factor, let me preface that very briefly here, and we'll talk more about it later, is that the composition of refugees is different. Because in Switzerland, and that's what we will build on in a second, asylum seekers and refugees arriving to the country are quasi-randomly allocated across these cantons, obviously under some proportionality constraints, meaning larger canton taking proportionally more refugees than smaller cantons. So what we see here is that placement matters. The other thing that really matters for refugee outcomes and predicts if someone makes a successful transition into employment are the characteristics of the refugees. And that looks like a complicated figure, but it's actually quite straightforward. What we see here are the effects of those characteristics that facilitate the transition into employment. And on the other hand, what we see on the left of this graph in the negative area is those characteristics that do hurt or do not help the transition into employment. So one way to read this is that if you speak French, not surprisingly, on average, that helps you to find a job. On the other hand, we see that compared to younger refugees, aged 18 to 29 years old, older refugees, say 50 plus, face more hurdles for the transition into the labor market. We also see here, for example, that the origin country matters, and that, for example, refugees from Sri Lanka and Iraq have an easier time to find a job than refugees from Somalia. Now, what we focus on with the GeoMatch tool is the synergies between the personal characteristics of the refugees and how they play out across different locations. And what we'll see is that the same personal characteristics do not have the same effect in all cantons. So one example that you see here is in the German-speaking canton of Solothurn. If you speak French, that doesn't facilitate the transition into employment. However, if you are assigned to French-speaking Vaud, that does increase the chances that you do find a job within 3 years. Now, you don't need a professor to tell you that language matters, but let me point towards the bottom of this figure, where you also see some more subtle interactions, some more subtle synergies between the refugee characteristics and the places that they are assigned to. For example, if I might ask you to focus briefly on Afghanistan, but you'll see that for people who come from Afghanistan to Solothurn, they do have an easier time to find a job than people from other nationalities. However, for people from Afghanistan assigned to Vaud, exactly the opposite is the case. Maybe because they don't have access to the same co-national and ethnic networks in Vaud than they have in Solothurn. And so identifying these synergies is an interesting academic exercise, and that we spend a lot of time and energy doing that. But what I really want to talk about today is how we can leverage these synergies to improve the placement of refugees such that we can find them, given their personal characteristics, that canton where they are most likely to succeed in the labor market. So how do we do this? Well, you basically see here a schematic diagram of how the GeoMatch algorithm works. What we need as an input is a lot of administrative data, information on past refugee arrivals, people that arrived in the past. We have to know where they come from, their gender, age, time of arrival, some other characteristics. And with that data, what we can do with a bit of machine learning is try to figure out which characteristics have particularly beneficial effects in which cantons. That's the first modeling stage. In the second stage, we use these synergies that we identified in the first stage and try to match newly arriving refugees to those cantons where, based on these predictions from the first stage, they are most likely to succeed. There are, of course, some constraints, and I'll talk more about those in a second, that we have to observe, including, obviously, we are not splitting families apart. And still larger cantons have to take in more refugees than smaller cantons. But even if we observe all these constraints, we are optimistic, as I'll show you based on data in a second, that if we assign refugees to those cantons where they are predicted to be most likely to succeed, we can considerably and substantially improve their integration outcomes. So, what we've done so far, based on existing data, is that we looked at where are past cohorts of refugees, in which cantons were they actually assigned to, and what does their employment look like after 3 years. And what you see is basically a summary of the plot with the cantonal variation that I showed you before. Here in orange, you see average refugee employment in Switzerland after 3 years is roughly at 15 to 16%. What we've done now, based on these backtests, that is simulation based on past data, is that we try to see how much would employment increase if we could optimally place refugees based on our GeoMatch algorithm and the prediction which canton is best for them given their characteristics. And depending on the constraints that we implement, including not tearing families apart, still assigning a higher fraction of refugees to larger cantons and a smaller fraction to smaller cantons, we do see that based on these backtest results, we can increase refugee employment all the way to about 26%. And so, as we see here with this very simple data-driven tool, we are optimistic that we can increase refugee employment, now calculated from actual employment up to algorithmic, by between 30 and 50%. Fortunately, and this is not something that we've built in the algorithm, but something that came out of it, is that we do not only improve refugee outcomes on average, but we also improve refugee outcomes for each subgroup. And so as we see here, the algorithmic assignment is beneficial for young refugees and for old refugees. It's beneficial for female and male refugees. It's beneficial for those who speak French, but also for those who don't speak French. And it's beneficial for all types of origin countries. And that's just the first step, but speaks to questions of algorithmic fairness, where we have to make sure that if we implement these data-driven tools, that we not only improve outcomes on average, but also for each specific subgroups. And that's a point that is very important to us that I will get back to later on as well. So, I hope so far I was able to give you at least a preview of not only how the GeoMatch algorithm leverages existing data to improve refugee outcomes for future arrivals, but also that why we are quite optimistic that we can actually achieve those gains that I just showed you. But backtest, statistics, and simulations is one thing. The real world test is, of course, another thing. And so that's why we are extremely excited to test this algorithm at the moment in collaboration with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration. Just before I go to the case study, a quick summary of what the GeoMatch algorithm does. So what we do is that we use insights from existing data to enhance the allocation process. Based on these backtests, we've seen that there is potential for robust gains across different contexts and for all types of refugee groups. The algorithm is very cost efficient. It's a little bit of our time and our colleagues in the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration who have to provide the data. It's extremely scalable and actionable for not all, but a large subset of the refugee population. The algorithm is also very flexible. We can also incorporate other outcome metrics. It doesn't just have to be employment outcomes. We could also look at salaries. We could also look at the grades and school success that refugee children have. And if that's desired, we could also incorporate preferences and information from refugees themselves, if they have some information about where they think they are most likely to succeed. And importantly, that algorithm is not a one-off thing, but we can then dynamically adapt it over time on a regular basis, such that we do not optimize on all synergies, but adapt it to new synergies to consistently improve through this feedback loop the performance of the algorithm. Now, let me briefly talk about one of several implementation case studies that we have in the works. And not surprisingly, I will focus on the one with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration. And I'm very happy and also a little proud to say that's the first randomized control trial in the entire world in which we, in collaboration with the ministry, can test this algorithm. So I hope my friends and colleagues from the ministry don't mind if I simplify the slightly more complex asylum process a little bit. But here's what you have to keep in mind to understand how we implement the algorithm. That's the status quo asylum process. So asylum seekers cross the border, come to Switzerland, arrive at a reception and processing center, and apply for asylum. Within a few weeks or months, then the allocation officer in the headquarters of the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration randomly assigns these newly incoming asylum seekers and refugees across the 26 cantons, again, observing several constraints, including family unification, including the fact that larger cantons have to take in more refugees than smaller cantons. And then within a few days, the asylum seeker and refugee is relocated to the canton, receives accommodation, access to the labor market, and so on and so forth. Now, where we and the GeoMatch algorithm comes in is not surprisingly at this allocation stage. The process that we are now testing in collaboration with the State Secretariat is that as soon as a new case comes in for distribution, the case officers enters the key personal characteristic about the refugee in a custom-built program that we jointly designed with the ministry. I'll show you how that looks in a second. Then after the entering of that information, which takes a few seconds, the case officer hits the send button and receives within a few milliseconds a list of recommendations of the best canton where the refugee with those characteristics is most likely to find a job within the next 3 years. Importantly, it is then the case officer who has a final review. All the algorithm does is it makes a recommendation of where, based on past cohorts, we believe this refugee is most likely to succeed. But it's up to the case officer to look, accept, or override this recommendation. In the case that the case officer rejects and overrides this recommendation, she sends us a quick note, which then allows us via this feedback loop to improve the algorithm and continually learn from the data that is entered in that information. What does this interface software that we designed looks like? It's not very beautiful. You see a screenshot here, but it works. And most importantly, we again, did not design this in the ivory tower sitting here in Zurich, but by really observing how the case office, the allocation officers of the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration do their job, and how we can build a custom designed piece of software that nicely integrates and interfaces in their current workflow. And so this is what the interface looks like. The assignment allocation officers enter this information, clicks the button, submits the data, and then within a few milliseconds receives a recommendation for a particular canton, looks at this, checks if that's okay, and either accepts or rejects that recommendation. We have, after we did a technical pilot in 2019 that made sure that the system that we've built works in the way that it's supposed to work and doesn't have any unexpected side effects, then transitioned jointly with the ministry to a full-scale pilot test that also allows for an impact evaluation to exactly see how much this algorithmic assignment is improving refugee outcome. That double-blind randomized controlled trial started in 2020. It's still ongoing, so I don't have any outcome data to show you. But the way this works is that we jointly agreed to focus on a group of 2,000 refugee families. Half of those, 1,000 refugee families randomly selected, will be assigned across the 26 cantons based on the GeoMatch algorithm, based on what we believe is the best canton for them. The other 1,000 refugee families will be assigned through the status quo process that is randomly across the 26 cantons. And what that allows us to do is, after 2 to 3 years, because even with optimized data-driven allocation, integration does take some time. After 2 to 3 years, we are able to see how much those that are our algorithmically assigned actually do have higher labor market outcomes than those that are randomly assigned via the status quo process. And if you guys are kind enough to invite me back to one of your summits or follow our research, we are very much looking forward to publish these results about how much we are actually, based on this randomized control trials, are able to improve outcomes within the next few years. So please do stay tuned. So let me just take a few minutes, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for Q&A afterwards, about some of the maybe broader first learnings from this collaboration with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration, but also other refugee and migration ministries across the world that we are working with. I hope that some of these learnings are also interesting and relevant for other collaborations between researchers and policymakers in this very sensitive, but also extremely important space of migrant and refugee integration. So a few of the learnings and insights that we generated based on this project on how to collaborate between research and governments to implement data-driven tools. The first thing that I believe is really key to the success of this project is the emphasis on co-design, that researchers, policymakers, and ministries really work closely together to co-design these human-centered and customized artificial intelligence and machine learning tools. That not only facilitates seamless implementation, but is also important for actual adoption by the ministries and the government agencies. And it's absolutely essential that not we, the researchers, and not the machine learning tools that we build will have final decision-making power. That has always to be the case, lie in the domain of the allocation officers in the ministries that they work with. All we can and all we should do is just make recommendations based on the patterns that we see in past data. And I think that feeds into this big and important debate about how to implement artificial intelligence, machine learning, data-driven tools in an ethically responsible way. One way to make sure that it is responsible is, on the one hand, not just to show that on average, refugees benefit from being, in this case, algorithmically placed across locations, but that all subgroups of refugees benefit, such that we are not contributing to existing inequalities in this among refugees and other migrant populations. I personally also believe that rigorous evaluations are absolutely key. While you could make a good argument, I think, for more quickly proceeding with the rollout of these tools. After all, we've published in Science the backtest results that we expect to increase refugee outcomes by 30 and more percent. It's important to first work on small pilot programs like the one that we do with the Swiss State Secretariat for Migration to make sure not only does the algorithm work as intended and increases refugee outcomes across all subgroups, but that there are also no other side effects. And that's exactly the same way how you should test these data-driven tools, like you want to test a new drug or vaccine in the current context, namely with randomized controlled trials, where you can make sure that there are no confounding factors that are leading to the differences in outcome between those that are algorithmically assigned and those that are randomly assigned. And lastly, it's important, of course, to adjust to a quickly developing regulatory context. But those developments for us researchers, and I also think for governments, and these collaborations are actually a very helpful, a very useful thing, because now we have more guidelines about how to structure these collaborations, how to share and protect extremely sensitive data, and how to evaluate the benefits, but also challenges and limitations of these data-driven tools. And so I really do hope that I was able to give you, on the one hand, a preview of how we are working at the Immigration Policy Lab together with our stakeholders and governments, and how we think about where the potential, but also some of the challenges with these data-driven tools are. And lastly, I really hope that the presentation today was just the start of a longer conversation. And so if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, or if you're interested in receiving more information about the work that we do, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me and my colleagues at the Immigration Policy Lab. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominik Hangartner. Yes, our audience is not hesitating at all. They have questions already for you. Yes, take a sip, you will need it, so you can answer the question. So the first question is from Andrea Bregoli. He asks, how do you define gainful employment?
That's a fantastic question, and apologies that I wasn't clear about this before. So, in the context that I just talked about in Switzerland, we do have some amazing registry data. And as always with these data-driven tools, the output is as good as the input. Unfortunately, here in the Swiss case, we do have population-level data on all asylum seekers and refugees. I do have to say, however, when it comes to employment, what we have is an indicator if someone has a job, when they started doing their job. We also see if they leave the job and what type of job it is. And so in the context of Switzerland, that's what we optimize on. That wasn't our decision, of course. That's a decision that the policymakers, the ministry, had to make. All we can do is provide some information about the pros and cons of different outcome measures. Let me just add one more thing. We also are working on a similar pilot with the Dutch ministry. And there, we not only use data on if someone has a job, but also some information on the earnings that they have. And that allows you to optimize on both increasing the propensity that people have a job, but also maybe that people have a job that fits their skill sets and their education. And so that's one of the benefits of the algorithm, that it's very flexible in terms of the outcomes that you want to focus on. But importantly, in all the countries that we work with this algorithm, we focus on those people who work in the formal sector.
All right, thank you for your answer. We have one more question to add. Do you also consider employment volatility, that is refugee asylum seekers that enter and leave employment multiple times?
Yes, that is one thing that we can also consider. Fortunately, in Switzerland, we have detailed data on this. And there is quite a bit of volatility. There's also some seasonality because some people find a job, say, in the construction industry during the summer months, but then are laid off over the winter. And so one thing that we are not doing at the moment, because it didn't turn out to be highly influential for the predictions of which is the best canton for which person, but that's definitely something that could also be taken into account. Fortunately, in Switzerland, with the outcome measure that we agreed to use, again, in discussions with the ministry, focusing on gainful employment after 3 years, that seems to be a sweet spot between capturing those people who find a job very early, but also optimizing for those who take a little longer to find a job. And what it turns out to be the case, if for me, the best place to find a job is, say, the canton of Zurich in year 1, there is a very high chance that the canton of Zurich is also the best place for me in year 2, 3, 4, and 5 after arrival. And that obviously makes the job of these data-driven tools a lot easier.
Very interesting. Dominik, I have one more personal question that was bugging me. So if you are allocating workers to employment based on their knowledge, that's totally exciting, I have to say, with that GeoMatch program. But on the other hand, I was wondering if we are creating a very homogeneous society. So let's say all the French-speaking asylum seekers are being located in the French part. What is the goal? Is it just on an economic level, or do you also pursue to have a diverse and multicultural community?
I'm so happy that you asked that question, and I was really hoping that it comes up so that I can elaborate on this very, very briefly if I have 30 more seconds. So in Switzerland, it is the case that at least for the largest origin countries, refugees have to be dispersed across Switzerland. What I mean by that is that at the end of the year, the share of newly assigned refugees from, say, Afghanistan or Iraq in the canton of Vaud, French-speaking, has to be exactly the same, the share, as in the canton of Zurich and all other cantons. And that's a constraint that is designed to overcome ethnic enclaves and not create this homogeneous society, refugee society that you created. And of course, those are constraints that we also observe with the GeoMatch algorithm. Meaning, when we assign people to cantons, we not only make sure that families stay together and larger cantons receive proportionally more refugees, but also that at the end of each year, the share of refugees from a particular origin country is the same across all these cantons. And so that makes sure that we, with this algorithm, are not contributing to such a homogeneous society with ethnic clusters that you just mentioned.
All right. Thank you very much for answering our questions, Dominik Hangartner, and thank you for joining us in the summit.
Thank you.